Throughout the 20th century, there were moments that defined generations. For millions of Americans, that moment lasted for nearly a decade on a small peninsula in Southeast Asia.
During the Vietnam War, the big question was, is this something we should do? One side said that we are here trying to prevent the spread of communism, trying to prevent the fall of dominoes, because the communist system is trying to take over the world, and the communist system is not good for humanity. I was on that side. At that point in time, I had no other reason to be on that side than my faith in my elders.
The Vietnam War was a conflict that lasted for so long, some don't even know what to call its beginning. Its outcome, though, forever changed the way America viewed war. Extraordinary moments of heroism, combined with unthinkable acts of horror, blended together the images of war Americans have been accustomed to for a generation. Ever since the end of the Second World War, Vietnam had been a battleground. With every corner of the world changing, desire for political evolution in the tiny country also grew, and for 8 years, communist revolutionaries fought the French who had once colonized their nation. In the middle of the 1950s, the United States began to send military advisors into South Vietnam, hoping they would contain the communists in the north. But by 1964, at the height of the Cold War, and when it was believed that the threat of North Vietnam was too imminent, the United States was prepared to do whatever was necessary to prevent any further spreading of communism throughout Southeast Asia. And in doing so, galvanized its own nation in a way that had never been seen before. Nearly 4 million Americans served during the Vietnam War. 58,000 of them would be killed. Young men volunteered to fight in South Vietnam in the name of patriotism, while others questioned the politics behind the war. For the city of Philadelphia, the birthplace of democracy in the United States, its citizens would sacrifice just as much as any other place in America. Young men from across the city would serve in the mountains and jungles of Vietnam. They risked their lives in combat and exposed themselves to horrors no human being should ever have to see.
Government, we write that blank check, and it's payable up into our lives. I mean, we served. And like I said, the biggest thing is, there aren't a whole lot of us left.
I grew up in North Philly around 11th and Ontario through the 60s, growing up, worked. Everybody hung out on the corners, the neighborhood. I had a 65 GTO.
Well, I grew up in a section of South Philly that was basically in the heart of South Philly at 10th and Morton, about a block from the infamous Pat's and Gino's Steakhouse. And it was great living there.
I grew up in North Philadelphia. It was hard growing up. We had gang fights going on. I used to stay out of gang fights. My childhood was great. I had great parents, believe it or not. My parents was great. Went to church, sang in the choir.
I grew up in the Lawndale section of Philadelphia, which was in the far northeast, I guess, or the greater northeast at that time. I went to Frankfort High School.
As a kid, you're always out there playing G.I. Joe and running around. Whether you actually thought about being in the military at that time, I really couldn't tell you. But, it was there because all my uncles and my father and all had just come out of World War II. So I guess, it's in the back of your mind what it would be like to actually be in the service.
With President Johnson now holding legislative power to direct the situation in Vietnam, fighting immediately increased throughout 1965.
There are two major types of enemies in Vietnam. One was Viet Cong. Viet Cong were the South Vietnamese who lived there, who were villagers, who had a rifle buried somewhere and could pull it out and go do something and then come back and bury it, and they were just a rice farmer.
The Viet Cong were functioning all across the South, acting as guerrilla forces composed of villagers who supported the communist government in the North. They blended seamlessly into the civilian population and struck against American troops by surprise. By March of 1965, as ground activity increased in the South, Operation Rolling Thunder was initiated. It became the largest air raid to date, during which U.S. jet bombers and South Vietnamese Sky Raiders bombed targets all across North Vietnam. The overwhelming bombing was meant to send a message to the communists in the North and persuade them to abandon their support of the Viet Cong. Hopefully, they would enter negotiations and end the war on favorable terms. The campaign lasted for over 3 years.
By March of '65, we were on our way to Westpac. This terminology they used, Western Pacific, and I picked up the ship in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and we had picked up 1,200 Marines, and we're heading for Okinawa, and they were there to go training because they were going to be sent to Vietnam shortly thereafter. USS Montrose, it was the APA-212, was the amphibious personnel attack. That was the APA designation. We had trained Marines in Okinawa. The first amphibious operation we were on was, I believe, Harvest Moon, and it was Amphibious Squadron 5 out of San Diego. It was probably May and June of '65. We had landed troops on a pre-dawn op, which was pre-dawn operations was before the sun came up. So we landed the troops at night. Basically, it was dark. And we carried 1,200 Marines on the ship.
On March 8th, over 5,000 Marines arrived at Da Nang Air Base at the request of General William Westmoreland. He said they were there to relieve the South Vietnamese Army of combat duties. A week later, Westmoreland requested an additional 40,000 troops to reinforce the South Vietnamese Army. For the next 2 months, American Marines engaged the Viet Cong while out on patrols throughout the South, and by the summer, clashes became so frequent and severe, Westmoreland ordered the start of search and destroy missions. By the end of November, after returning from a trip to Vietnam, U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara informed President Johnson that the Viet Cong were getting stronger, while the South Vietnamese government was not gaining wide support. American forces faced 2 options, he said: seek a compromise settlement and keep further military commitments in Vietnam to a minimum, or continue to press for a military solution. He also said that there was no guarantee of U.S. military success in Vietnam, and that U.S. killed in action can be expected to reach 1,000 a month.
They take us in, process us, and from there, assign you to a unit. Now, my unit that I was assigned to was the 1st Brigade of the 101st Airborne Division. And then I was shipped up to Kontum, which is in the Central Highlands, where I actually was assigned to my unit within the 101st. It wasn't long after I got to Kontum that we were transported by Hueys out to an operation up toward the Laotian border. They really didn't give us any training on how to exit a chopper or anything like that. We strictly got that on the job, so to speak. And my first time, about 6 feet above the top of the grass, and the guy said, "Okay, everybody out." Stood out on the skid and jumped. So anyway, from that point, we did a foot patrol, and we went, God knows where we were, because I think we got left off in the wrong spot to begin with. And we encountered a lot of abandoned camps and fortifications that meant that it was a fairly active area for the VC. And as we went down the trail further, our lead element encountered a Chinese trainer, or like the equivalent to our special forces, that basically their job's training. And he was training the VC. And him and a couple of the VC traded fire with our point men. The guy, the VC were killed, and the trainer was wounded. So that was basically my baptism of fire.
In July, 8,500 Marines, along with 2,500 South Vietnamese troops, conducted Operation Hastings in the Quang Tri province of Ai Corps. Their mission was to drive a North Vietnamese Army division across the demilitarized zone that divided North and South Vietnam.
Whatever we wanted was on our back. So if we'd stop to eat, you had canned sea rations. And just open them up and eat what you had. Sometimes we were able to heat the can with some heat tabs, and you heat it up and get it warm, and then you'd have that to eat.
Oh yeah, jungles was, first time I ever went to some dense forest when I went to Vietnam was like that. It was a jungle, triple canopy. It was thick, I got to use a machete to walk through it, Then you had to worry about all kinds of insects and snakes and lizards. It was something else. The heat, definitely had to get used to the heat.
In August, a sequel to Operation Hastings was initiated. For the entire second half of 1966, 11 battalions of U.S. Marines swept just south of the DMZ against 3 battalions of a North Vietnamese division. By the end of the year, just fewer than 6,700 servicemen had been killed, and the CIA reported 24,000 North Vietnamese deaths from Operation Rolling Thunder. 80% of them were civilians.
Well, his interests and hobbies at that time, growing up, he used to like to draw maps, and he was a good student, just active with the Boy Scouts, and he graduated from Overbrook High in West Philadelphia, and his goal was to complete his education in the military, as so many other members of our family did. So after he graduated from Overbrook High and was inducted into the military, we were hoping that he would remain in the States for a while. But with him, being gung-ho as he was, he volunteered to go to Vietnam.
As American forces entered another year of the war, the 4th and 25th Infantry Divisions conducted border surveillance in the Pleiku and Kon Tum provinces of the Central Highlands. The operation was to prevent the North Vietnamese from moving troops and equipment into South Vietnam from sanctuaries in Cambodia and Laos. The operation lasted until April.
When we landed, you're flying over the country just like you do now, and you're looking out the windows and you're finally starting to see breaks in clouds, and you can see the ground here and there, and you see these clouds coming up in the ground, smoke, and you're wondering what it is at that time. You don't really know, but it was probably artillery shooting. And then we landed, and everything was okay at first, and they opened up the door, and I was sort of pretty far back on the plane, but all of a sudden the humidity hit us. It was so humid, and then the heat, and we weren't even in the sun yet. We hadn't even been off the plane yet, and all of a sudden you realize this is going to be tough, and plus people are going to be shooting at us.
At the end of March, Martin Luther King Jr. took a brief absence from his role as civil rights activist when he led 5,000 people in a march during an anti-war demonstration in the U.S. He declared that the Vietnam War was a blasphemy against all that America stands for.
Well, I went to Cu Chi first. That's about 35, 40 miles northwest of Saigon. Went there first. That's where the 25th Division was. When you first get there, every noise you hear, you're ducking. After a little while, you're getting to know where that noise came from. But mortars, they were different because they went up and they came down, and you could be in a little tiny hole by yourself, just big enough for you, but a mortar could come in there. I had a friend got killed that way. All the mortars were hitting in this one area, and I seen guys wounded before and all that stuff, but I never actually seen guys torn up this way. One guy, Sergeant Gary Bird, he was laying in a hole, and one landed in the hole. He was blown apart. This friend of mine, it turned out his name was John Edwards, Sergeant. He was next to the medic when it started, and they got in a ditch. It was only 1.5 feet or so wide, and one landed right next to him, and blew him apart. But when I saw this guy Gary Bird and a couple other guys that were wounded, I yelled for the medic, and he turned around, and this guy, he was just covered with blood. He was just covered with blood, and some of it was his, some of it was other people's, some of it was the sergeant I knew.
I was always south of Saigon. Actually, on operations, we would board the choppers early in the morning. Interesting, when you pick up by chopper and they drop you, you have cold LZs and hot LZs. Cold LZ is certainly a landing zone that usually is, fairly safe and you drop in. But hot LZs is when you're coming in and there's firing, and you have to get down, just get out of the chopper really quick. They would drop down and we would go through the different villages and we would look for the VC. We would look for, different types of caches and things like that and try to destroy. We'd go into a village and we'd ask, have you seen any VC? And they said, no enemy here. And we probably don't go 300 yards out and somebody hits a booby trap because they booby trapped all that area. I, started a lot of IVs, carried blood expanders, administered morphine. Some of the guys that were just, in their last breath, trying to make them as comfortable as you can. They're not going to make it. You try to stabilize and get them onto the dust off as much as possible. You're called on. You're called on to do a duty, and you're there, whether it be under fire, but you're also there listening to the guys that maybe are troubled or whatever it is, and they come to you. They come to Doc. Every medic's name was Doc.
By the middle of July, the U.S. 3rd Marine Division conducted Operation Kingfisher in the area just south of the DMZ to screen enemy movement into the Quang Tri province. The operation lasted until October 31st. 340 Americans were killed in a number of pitched battles between the Marines and the NVA. As the fall of '67 arrived, Marines continued to clash with the NVA below the DMZ, while the bombing in the north continued. On November 11th, as opposition against the war grew, American forces began Operation Wheeler. It was a search and destroy mission to drive the enemy out of the Quang Nam and Quang Tin provinces.
On that particular day, my husband, my mother, and I had gone shopping, and just as we were about to approach the street where we live, my husband started slowing down because he noticed a van. Actually, it was more of a station wagon type of vehicle, like a station wagon. And so my mother said, why are you slowing down? Almost to the point where he almost stopped. He said, I don't think I like the looks of this. And just as we got to our door, and I used my key and unlocked the door with my mother in back of me, this captain slowly got out of this vehicle, this station wagon, and he walked slowly over to my husband, and he said, you're the Cheek family? And my husband said, yes, we are. We had proceeded into our house and gone inside. And my mother kept saying, we all had a bad feeling. So then when we got inside to our living room, my husband said to him, will you have a seat? He said, no. He said, I have some very disturbing news. Well, actually, when he said disturbing news, we did think maybe he's going to say Kenny had gotten injured or he was in a hospital somewhere, but that's not what he said. He said, the bad news that I have for you all is that you lost Kenny in Quang Tri. Quang Tri is the upper province of Vietnam. And boy, we were just shuddered. I mean, we were shattered, you know. It's pretty hard to reminisce, but it's something that will always be with me that particular day. It's not even easy to talk about, but it's something that I don't want to lay dormant within me. I have to talk about it. It's helpful sometimes to talk about it.
On November 17th, as American forces continued to battle the Viet Cong across South Vietnam, the North declared a 7-day ceasefire for the upcoming Tet holiday. By the end of the year, U.S. troops had suffered over 16,000 casualties since the start of the war. Over 1.5 million tons of bombs had been dropped, and over $21 billion had been spent on the war. And no sign of victory or an end was in sight.
When we arrived in Vietnam, we arrived in Bien Hoa, which is a large air base, a large logistics center. Bien Hoa and Long Binh, large logistics center, and then they sent the battalion up to Phuc Vinh, which was outside the Michelin rubber plantation. But shortly after I got there, I was assigned as a rifle platoon leader. It's a tough position. It's a tough learning position because you have to make decisions, life and death decisions. I would be probably more anxious making those decisions now than I was then.
"1968 began with a massive enemy attack on the 1st of February. Early that morning, NVA soldiers launched a nationwide offensive, attacking Saigon and other major cities. All the way from the Mekong Delta to the DMZ, Allied targets were attacked, catching U.S. forces by surprise. Nearly 1,000 Viet Cong troops infiltrated Saigon, while other VC and NVA forces captured the imperial city of Hue. In Saigon, it took a week of bitter fighting to drive the VC out.
We got called at 2 o'clock in the morning and, to go down to the runway to be ready to be picked up. And we didn't know what about because there was no attack in Phuoc Vinh. There were attacks in Bien Hoa, there were attacks in Saigon, there were attacks in dozens of cities around the country, but there was none in Phuoc Vinh. But we were a reaction force, so we get called out like about 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning to go down and stand by on the airfield. And they picked us up on the airfield at Phuoc Vinh, and we flew south. And we didn't know where we were going. In a military operation, before you get on the airplane, you prefer to know where you're going and have a concept of what you're going to do when you get there. But in this case, we didn't. So we fly, and we're flying with our weapons locked and loaded because we think we're going into combat. But we come down through the clouds, and we come down through the clouds. One of the few things that we can recognize in South Vietnam is Bien Hoa and the Bien Hoa airstrip. It's a very large airstrip. And we didn't know why we were going to Bien Hoa. We thought that maybe we were stopping there for refueling. We get down to about 20 feet, and suddenly there's green tracers. Green tracers came from Soviet weapons. The NVA and had gotten into the edge of Bien Hoa, and the reason we were going to Bien Hoa is that's where the fight was. So we landed on the main runway, which is very unusual. Before we saw tracers, I knew something was unusual because we were coming into the main runway. Helicopters come into Bien Hoa, but you don't need a runway, so normally you're coming off from the side. You're coming right down to the main runway. It's kind of like, why are we doing this? As soon as the airplane gets close enough to the ground, helicopter gets within a few feet of the ground, you want to get off the helicopter because that's the target. Get off the helicopter, get into the ditch at the side of the runway, and we were in that ditch for 4 or 5 hours before they were able to get the machine guns, which were 250 meters away at the end of the runway. And where we were, we didn't have a good fire, and we couldn't get them from where we were. But they finally got those, and we got out of there. But it took us about 3 or 4 days. There was a major fight going on down in Saigon. We were up in Bien Hoa and Long Binh area, and so there were some tough fights around those places.
News of the Tet Offensive was broadcast all across America, shocking the nation. By the end of the month, thousands of civilians had been massacred by the North. Hundreds of American GIs were killed in the effort to repel the attacks, and for the rest of March and April, the military would conduct major operations around Saigon to eliminate persisting threats to the capital. At the end of March, President Johnson gave a televised speech to the nation announcing that he would not be running for another term as president, making many feel that his presidency had become another casualty of the war. The following month, North Vietnam and the United States met in Paris to begin peace talks in hopes of ending the war.
After Tet, we were just north of Bien Hoa, and then we moved up to Cu Chi. Cu Chi was an area that was 40 kilometers to the northwest of Saigon. It supposedly was an area that had traditional ties with the Ho Chi Minh, but we know that we had a lot of combat there that summer. That summer in July, probably had 15 of the KIAs that we had. First was Joe Hillman from Alabama. Joe was kind of a little bit of a dour guy, but he was a guy that was always willing to help. Whatever was being done or needed to be done, he was a guy that was there being part of getting it done. This was surrounded by a hedgerow, or a series of small trees, probably 3 or 4 inch diameter, almost like bamboo, but a different type of thing. And as he was going up and over this, there was a bad guy, and he had a rifle, And as Joe came up and went over it, the bad guy shot, and he hit Joe twice, and Joe died. Rich Toletti was just a few days later, and he was, they were crossing a large rice paddy dike, and they were suddenly taken under fire. He looked up at the wrong time, and he took a round right through the head. There's sorrow, because you know the person and you feel close to them. There's frustration. Let me at those bastards. I'm going to get them. I don't know. It's resignation. It's tough. It's tough.
You got to keep doing what you have to do. You can't worry about these guys. They're dead. You can't dwell on the fact that your friend just got killed. You got to get back to what you were doing. You got to and you got to be doing it right. We had a saying, don't mean nothing. But when in fact it meant everything. But that was our way of getting through this. It don't mean nothing.
By the end of October, President Johnson announced, due to the favorable developments in the Paris peace talks, that he had ordered a complete halt of the bombing inside North Vietnam, officially ending Operation Rolling Thunder. After nearly 4 years, the results of the campaign were unimpressive. A total of 304,000 flights had been flown over the North, with very little impact on the war in the South. A few weeks later, Richard Nixon was elected President of the United States. Nixon promised to bring the war in Vietnam to an end by achieving peace with honor.
June 1st was a tough day, and June 1st was a day that I had 23 days left in country, and Dave Squires from Louisville, Kentucky, had 9 days left. And we got a call that our unit got into an ambush. And they asked for myself and another medic and the doctor. They're going to bring the battalion surgeon in. When we got the call, I said, I'll go. And Dave come to me and said, I want to go. I said, Dave, you can't. You got 9 days left in country. Interesting about David was a conscientious objector, and he used a lot of conscientious objectors as medics in Vietnam. They didn't believe in killing, but they believed in healing, and they didn't carry weapons. Dave never carried a weapon. So he convinced me. Dave convinced me that, let's go. So they picked myself up, the doctor, and Dave, and they dropped us in the area where supposedly our men were, but it wasn't our group. They dropped us in the wrong area, right in the middle of an ambush. The only thing is I heard this firing, and I knew that that's where I had to go towards. I kept walking towards that. And when I walked into this group, it was 2nd and 39th, and it was Bravo Company, and these guys were hit pretty bad. And I think, I was on my 3rd patient, and that's when I picked up a M79 grenade launcher that I, started firing and tried to suppress as much as I could, and then I started pulling them out. And I got hit about 2 o'clock. I got hit at the same time, and I just gave myself 2 shots of morphine and kept going. So it was a pretty tough day. Dave Squires, Dave got killed. He got shot. I imagine he probably took a mortal wound. I talked to someone afterwards and said he died in his arms, so he didn't last very long when he got shot. It's taken me a long time, and I still remember it. And could I have been different? Could it changed? Could I have said, no, Dave, you can't go out. You got 9 days left. Could I have been stronger about that? I've worked through that. And what it is that it was his decision to make as well. but it took me a long time to get through that.
My first year, 30 people in our company were killed. A company in the field is 100 men. So I knew a lot of people that got killed. In a rifle battalion, in an infantry battalion, there's 4 rifle companies, and each one has 4 platoons. That means there's 16 platoon leaders. 8 platoon leaders were killed the year I was there. Another 4 or 5 were wounded seriously enough to be evacuated, and there was only 2 or 3 of us that lasted through the year, and I was the only guy that lasted through the year on the line, in other words, as a platoon leader. So it was a very tough year.
I had never heard of Vietnam. I didn't really take an interest or know much about the war in Vietnam until my son enlisted. I knew there was a war going on because you couldn't avoid it at that time. It wasn't like today, you know. It was on the news constantly, and it was in the papers constantly. And at that time, I was reading 2 papers a day, and I was paying attention to the news. And of course, there were so many casualties. But he did love music, and he was in a band, a little band, for a while. He also loved to sing. He played guitar. I bought him a guitar when he was 16. That was the gift that I gave to him because of his love for music.
In the middle of March, President Nixon ordered the illegal bombing of Cambodia in a covert operation. U.S. bombers hit staging areas and troop concentrations in the eastern part of the country, just 5 miles from the Vietnam border. The secret bombings lasted for 14 months. On June 8th, President Nixon announced his plan to withdraw 25,000 combat troops by August. It was the start of a program known as Vietnamization, in which American troops turned the war over to the South Vietnamese. Several weeks into the start of American withdrawal, a Gallup poll showed 42% of Americans favored a quicker withdrawal from Vietnam.
Russell Smith comes from Maryland. He's probably about the same age as I was, but he came into the Army and I think he was a draftee and just was going to do his 2 years and get out. Smitty was always a positive guy and always willing to do the tough work. But he had been my RTO for a while, but then he was rotated out to go to a platoon. But he came to talk to me and told me that he really, really had a bad premonition. He really wanted to leave the field. And I was the guy that had to tell him, I can't send everybody out of the field that wants to go out of the field. That's not the way it works. And I have a lot of I have bad premonitions too, but you just try to stick through it. And well, it turns out his bad premonition was accurate. And he was in a foxhole, and we got mortared. He was in a foxhole, and a round landed in amongst them. He and one other guy were in the same foxhole, both were killed. It was actually very good in that we probably had 50 mortar rounds and only 2 guys killed. That was a very good thing, but it was very bad that he was gone, and I guess I feel guilty because he was specifically asking me in the week before that he really wanted to leave the field because he had a bad premonition. And I was the guy representing the institution that said, we can't do this. You know, the way it works is the Army's paying us to be here, we're here. You know, if you're seriously ill and need treatment, yes, we certainly send you in. But those are tough decisions. It's tough when you have to look at somebody and say, I really want to go. Well, you really can't. I'm sorry.
My responsibilities initially were pretty much a rifleman the first week or two, and I got a squad probably my 3rd week in, so I was responsible for about 5 or 6 people. At times we did reconnaissance work, we set up, hid, tried to identify enemy forces, locations, and more importantly, size. But for the vast majority of the time, where we were on what they call search and destroy missions. I mean, there was one in April that haunts me. I was in Sydney, Australia, on R&R, and just before I went to Australia, we were in a pretty hot area, and we were having contacts almost every day, so we were doing hit-and-run ambushes. This was closer to On K. We would set up an ambush. When the enemy came, we would trigger the ambush and then take off, because we knew we were in the midst of a large unit. Well, 3 days after I was on R&R, the platoon leader decided that, well, they found a very large road that was hidden by triple canopy jungle. They came across this road, and nobody wanted to set up an ambush on the road except the platoon leader, because it was large enough to handle trucks and mechanized units. And you know, my squad leaders couldn't talk him out of it, so he made him set up an ambush, and turned out a battalion-sized unit came down that road. I had 25 guys. When I went on R&R, I came back to 11. A couple got men killed, and I think there were like 8 wounded. And you know, you try not to get close to the people around you. Couldn't help it at times, though.
In September, over 250,000 demonstrators rallied in Washington to end the war in Vietnam. Major protests were also held in a number of cities throughout Europe to coincide with the march in Washington. Paris, Frankfurt, Stuttgart, West Berlin, and London all held rallies.
Well, I was working in Alexandria, Virginia, which is right outside Washington, D.C. And I was in an office with a lot of people that morning. And this uniformed individual walked in, and I noticed that he had a cross on his lapel. And he stepped inside the door, and he asked if he could speak to me. So I went over to him, and that was the last thing from my mind. When I saw the cross, I thought, oh, Rex must be sick, or he must have been wounded. I mean, it was just fast forwarding through my head, because I just couldn't imagine why he was there to see me, because nothing was going to happen to my son. And when I went up to him, he introduced himself, and he said, "Is there a place where we can speak in private?" And so we had what was known as vendor rooms. And this room was about the size of a large coat closet. We went in there, and there was one chair, and there was a little desk. And he said, "You better sit down." And I sat down, and he said, "Right away, your son was killed yesterday in Vietnam." I said, "No, couldn't have been." And he said, "Well, he was. This was the 20th of November, 1969. And I didn't even ask for details. I just, I guess I said, 'Are you sure?' You know, and then I got up and I just ran out of this room. When we had the funeral at Arlington, it was such a cold day, and he's buried up on the hill on Sherman Drive. I would go to Arlington Cemetery almost every day, either before I went to work in the morning, and I had to be at work at 7:30. Sometimes at night, there was a gate there near his gravesite at that time, and there was a very low stone wall. And they didn't have the restrictions and the security at Arlington Cemetery like they have today. So I would even drive out there at night sometimes by myself and climb over that stone wall to get up to his grave. Just think. Wonder what happened and why. And still do.
It's difficult. It's just, but at the same time, you feel a great camaraderie with people that you think, if you were there doing this, you did it because you thought it was important and because you thought that it needed to be done. It wasn't something that you wanted to do. It wasn't something I wanted to stay there and do. It was something that I thought needed to be done. But that camaraderie is a very emotional thing. It's a very tight thing. It's something shared between people, and you know you've gone in harm's way and done something that's tough, and you're proud of that.
On February 19th, as peace talks continued in Paris, the air raids over Laos were made public, provoking a new wave of criticism regarding the policies of the Nixon administration in Indochina. Over a month later, while troops were continuing to leave Vietnam, Nixon gave authorization for ground operations in Cambodia. U.S. and South Vietnamese units spent the next 2 months clearing away communist sanctuaries in the neighboring country.
Then on March 12th, they wanted to open up Firebase Ripcord. They wanted to build this fire base on top of this hilltop called Ripcord to oversee the A Shau Valley and the Ho Chi Minh Trail there. They were trying to stop the NVA from coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, down in through the north, and they figured we can hold them up. There was a lot of activity with NVA in the area coming through. March 12th, we got on the helicopters and went on to Ripcord. My company was the one that was going to open it up, and it turned into a hot LZ. I lost my lieutenant and a few other guys from my platoon at that time. I did not get back up onto Firebase Ripcord. I always stayed in the lower hilltops and worked the areas around it. So I was always out in the field, in the mountains around it. There was usually a company of infantrymen up on the hill, and then you had the other companies would be around in the valleys and on the bottom of the fire base. You probably had about 600 guys, 600 Americans around the fire base at one time. We didn't know for sure how many NVA were in the area until later. Towards the end of the battle, but there was at least 2 regiments of NVA out there, and they were pulling in more guys. More NVA was coming down all the time. It was later found out that there was at least 10,000 NVA in the area. They were under all the hills. They were in tunnels under all the hills. We later found out that they had hospitals. July 22nd, we were going in one direction, and we were on a hilltop there, and they wanted us to get to a LZ to take us out of the area. We started moving out towards that, and they called us back and said we can't go to that one. There's too much activity out there that we have to turn around and get to another fire base. At that point, when we turned around, there were 76 of us, and we turned around and started to go down the hill towards the other towards the other LZ, when we walked right into 400 NVA were planning to attack us. They were right on top of us. They hit us with mortars, RPGs. They hit us with everything. They took out most of our guys at the beginning. We had 14 dead and 56 wounded. There was only 6 guys out of 76 that weren't wounded or killed. We fought them for about 6-7 hours straight. I was wounded 3 different times in that day. The mass confusion when they hit us with the mortars first, An MBA threw a satchel charge down the hill at me, and it blew up right in front of my face, and knocked me down the hill. And I start going back up the hill, and an RPG went off right beside me, and my arm got sliced open. I could put my third finger right into and touch my bone. It was sliced open. After that, the medic grabbed me and wrapped me up, and we still had to go up the hill. And I got wounded in the leg. And they just kept firing all around, and that's how a lot of us got wounded. And we ended up calling in, the Air Force dropped 250-pound bombs right on top of us. We beat them by dropping the bombs on top of us. And at that point, that was about getting dark. And we had to sit there on that hill all night long until another company came in the next day and rescued us. They were sending everybody to different hospitals all over the country, all over Vietnam, South Vietnam, because they did not want the media to know that we had so many wounded. They were trying to keep it quiet because the media was banned from covering the Battle of Ripcord. So they didn't let anybody have any footage. No film cameras were allowed out there. There was a lot of casualties. We lost, by the end of the battle, we lost 278 men.
We got off the coast of Quang Tri at nighttime on July 7th, say. And my first look of Vietnam was at night. I remember opening the hatch of the ship, the weather deck hatch to the outside of the ship, and seeing all those star shells bursting in the air and secondary explosions. That's when I said, holy shit, this stuff is real. I said, I could die here. Well, they had their own artillery, of course, inland, but they would also sometimes call for naval gunfire support. If their artillery couldn't reach a certain area, our ships would provide this support. Naval gunfire support is basically floating artillery. Wherever they need it, if our projectiles could hit it, we'd support them. We supported the ARVN Army, the South Vietnamese Army, because that later on in that 72, most of the American troops were out of Vietnam by then. So we were helping the ARVN Army, trying to retake the city of Quang Tri.
Well, I think when they overtook the embassy in Saigon, that was the end of the war. I mean, once they put the North Vietnamese flag up there, that was it. And I guess the book was closed at that point. There was nothing anybody else was going to do.
I wouldn't tell my parents when I was coming home because I wanted to be a surprise. Okay. So when I got home, luckily my sister lived across the street because my parents weren't home. So I went across the street, knocked on the door, and Andy, my nephew, he was 10 years old, and excuse me. As soon as he saw me, my dress blues, my hat, sea bag. And he goes, "It's Uncle Frankie!"
I lost 25 pounds. I went over at 165. I came back at 140. And it was weird. You didn't want to talk about it. Nobody wanted to ask you anything about it. So you wondered if people were looking at you a little weird because, of all the protesting that was going on at that time.
Well, when I came back home from Vietnam at the airport, I'm walking through the terminal. I got yelled at, baby killer, and the group and all these other people. I just turned around and it probably hurt because we were sent over there to do a job for the country and then we come back home and get treated the way we did.
I kind of took off my uniform and I didn't ever want to think about it again. I tried to forget it, but you just don't.
I don't know if it was in the mid-'80s when I started having problems, argued. You get really mad quick. It got worse. I got more arguments. I was doing drugs, marijuana. I smoked marijuana for, God, I don't know, 39, 40 years. And I did speed, I did coke. I probably drank a little bit too much. Don't do all the drugs anymore. I figure I'm too old. Don't want my heart to stop.
It was pretty hard. As for me, I know me, I didn't think I had a problem. I thought I was this hotshot partying and having a good time and doing everything I wanted to do, but I had a serious problem. I couldn't forget. I don't know what's worse, thinking about how scared I was, the guys I lost. Did I do enough? Didn't I do enough? The whole 9 yards.
The war took some things away from me. I have changed.
PTSD just wasn't recognized like it is today. And it's recognized today because of us. Because it's like any other kind of sore. The more it festers, the worse it gets. We learned, and we're passing that on, so it doesn't happen again.
For many years, they didn't even teach it in the schools. It was kind of something that wanted to be forgot. I think everybody should remember the Vietnam War always, all the time. If for nothing else, learn by it.